My name is Michaël Green, and I welcome you to the 20th episode of my podcast, Historians in Conversation, which is hosted by the University of Lodz in Poland. My podcast is dedicated to motivations that drive historians to pursue research. And today my guest is Gunnar Winsnes Knutsen from the University of Bergen. Gunnar teaches early modern history at the university, and his research focuses on various topics pertaining to Norwegian history, but also Spanish history, as well as digital humanities. Today we will hear from Gunnar about his career, about his life, how did he decide to study history, what did he do to achieve his professorial position, but also what motivated him to do history when the choice was not entirely clear. So I welcome Gunnar to my podcast, and I hope that you enjoy our conversation. Hello, Gunnar, and welcome to my podcast. I'm glad to see you. It's been a while since we had an opportunity to talk, and I think that we have a lot of things to discuss today about your professional career and motivation to do history in those rather interesting times.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you. I always start my podcast with the very same question, the question about your childhood. And I skimmed through your website, which I have to say is a very nice thing to have. And that website contains a very interesting biographical part about you. And I was actually fascinated because you were born in Sweden and you managed to live in 3 countries before you were 1 year old. And your grandparents were also traveling. Could you tell a little bit about that? About your family background?
Well, my mother's side of the family come from what you would probably call a middle class background. They were originally, like most Norwegians, farmers. Then in the 17th century, they sold the farm and became royal officials. So my maternal grandfather was born far up north because his father was a priest, and of course they were sent everywhere in the kingdom. And then for the last 2 or 3 generations, they have lived in Oslo. My father's side of the family are very different. They come from a line of sailors and fishermen, which means that, of course, my paternal grandfather was a sailor, and so he worked a lot in the US, which was common at that time, about 120 years ago. I never knew him because he died in 1944 when my father was 5 years old. But my grandmother, his wife, was also from an island in southern Norway. And when she was 16, basically her entire family in Norway had died of tuberculosis. And so her only remaining relatives of any substance were in the US. So she had to make her way to America. And of course, poor people couldn't travel. I mean, there's a myth about poor people immigrating to the US, but poor people couldn't afford a ticket. So she went to Christiania, which is today Oslo, worked in a bakery and became the manager of the bakery, saved up enough money to go to the US, waited a bit to go so that she could take the first train from Oslo to Bergen on the new railroad, and then took the ship from Bergen to New York, where she was met by her uncle. And so she worked as a maid for a medical doctor in New York City for a number of years. And so, of course, I grew up with this, stories about what is good for you and what is not good for you, according to a US medical doctor in the 1920s. That advice did not always agree with current medical advice, so to speak.
Pretty interesting.
Yeah, and then she was widowed twice. The second time, my father was the youngest child. This was in the 1930s with the Great Depression, so they had to sell their house. My grandfather lost his foot on an American ship, so he couldn't work there anymore, so he came home. And then he died, probably cancer. Nobody knows. People died at home. Nobody knows what they died of. So my father was born in poverty. He started working when he was 10. He left school when he was 14. When he was 17, he joined the Air Force. And in less than a year, he went from living in a house with no electricity or running water to being a radio technician on jet aircraft, which is an incredible jump in technology if you think about it.
It's a metamorphose, really.
Yeah, and then the education that he got in the Air Force was not recognized by Norwegian civil society. So he went to Sweden to study first, and then his Swedish polytechnic education was accepted in Scotland, so he went to Glasgow. And he graduated from the University of Strathclyde. And then he worked in telecommunications his entire life until he retired. And he became a director at LM Ericsson before retiring in 2000. So that was a bit more of an adventurous life than mine. He and my mother met when they were children because my mother's family was sufficiently well off to actually go on vacations. So they vacationed on the island where my father is from. That's how they met.
What island is
But
that?
it's an interesting place because it's a small fishing community, about 20 houses on an island. And when my father grew up, 3 of the men there had lost a limb on an American ship, a foot or an arm, which is amazing. 20 houses, and you have 3 people who have been incapacitated on American ships, not Norwegian ships. There were others.
What was it called? The island.
Bota. The island is spread also, yeah. The hamlet is Bota. And I still have this house where my father was actually born in the house. So that was my family history, very different on my father's side and on my mother's side. And of course, I mean, I frequently draw on this in my professional life and thinking about history too, because you see migration, but you also see that those who are well off, who are royal officials, do not travel as much as those who are less well off, who become sailors and fishermen or travel abroad. And in fact, one of the things that I discovered later when I worked with my supervisor at the University of Oslo was that in this part of the country, in the 17th century, you could not get a position as a maid without having a letter of recommendation from Amsterdam.
From Amsterdam.
Yes.
That's fascinating.
So, I mean, these connections are much, much deeper than we have traditionally thought about, because we think about elites because they're visible to us in our sources. And we are told in Norway, for example, that people had a very limited horizon because they could not travel. And that you can see that the same farm stays within the same family for generations. Sure, but what happens to the other children who don't inherit the farm? Where do they go? And I can tell you another story. I was 22, 23, and I was visiting my uncle who then lived in this house where my father was born. And he had been out fishing mackerel. He was a retired sailor, so he did some fishing and so on. So he used to go out early in the morning to fish for mackerel in the summer and then come back. And I knew he'd been out, but I was very surprised when I saw his fridge was full of Danish bacon and meat. And I said, "Have you been to Denmark?" And he said, No. We meet the Danish on the fishing fields at night. So we always exchange goods. And I had no idea about this. And I said, "Oh, of course, your grandfather used to do this as well." So suddenly I said, okay, there's an invisible connection here, but they meet on the same fishing fields. I mean, of course, they are going to become friends. Of course, they're going to trade, perhaps even intermarry.
Last year, I did some archival research in Trondheim, and I found I was looking after sources for study of privacy, and in particular some EU documents. And there was a very interesting correspondence of a Norwegian family with Amsterdam. And it turned out that there was some sort of trade network set up. between Trondheim and Amsterdam, and the children went to Amsterdam to study and eventually joined some Dutch firm and had very elaborate connection, I think, for 20 or 30 years. Unfortunately, I did not have time to research that correspondence further. Maybe it's something that I should do because it's really interesting now, especially that you say that it was a thing. So maybe it's worthwhile to get back to it.
Yeah, and you know, it sort of brought home to me how much is invisible. You know, what makes historical figures visible in our sources. And especially if you are an early modernist, then most of your sources are produced by institutions of authority, government or religious authority. And they always, I mean, when they talk about people, is when they want something from them, money or service,
Yeah.
or money or their body. And of course, people try to avoid that being detected in this way. So you have smuggling, you have informal networks, and so on. And it's very rare that this pops up in our sources. I mean, one of the few examples that I know about is these collections of letters that have been seized by privateers. Did you find, for example, in London?
Yeah.
You know, London is an excellent source of private letters from the Netherlands to and from the Netherlands. And of course, it's only because they have been taken by privateers that they exist today that we can know about them. But once you do that, you realize, okay, they were actually in correspondence. They were writing to their families. They were writing to their friends abroad. We just don't know it.
There is a lot of interest, I think, nowadays again in this kind of history. But let us get back to the story of your family. And you started telling me about your parents who met on the island where your grandfather was, where your father was born. And how did it develop? So they met as children.
Yeah, and then they met again as adults. My mother was visiting the family that they had been visiting as summer guests when she was a child. My father was on leave from the Air Force. And she needed somebody to row her from the Coastal Express and to the island. So that was my father.
Very romantic
with
story.
with my grandmother insisting on being there because there was a missus from the city, so she had to be there to see this. And then they kept in touch, and she was at that time living in Oslo. Then she got her first job, which was in England, in a Norwegian shipping company, running one of the ferry lines across the English Channel, and he went to Glasgow to study. And then they eventually got married in Stockholm, where I was then born. And he was already working for LM Ericsson, his first job as an engineer.
And what job did your mother do?
Well, she was a secretary, a financial secretary.
Interesting that a lot
She
of
worked in,
yeah,
I mean,
sorry.
she worked in companies in shipping from most of her youth, and then she also started working in telecommunications companies later on. So that's basically what I grew up with, people working in telecoms.
Interesting that a lot of Norwegians went to Sweden in different points. I'm thinking about the ABBA story where one of the singers is Norwegian born, and then her grandma took her away from Sweden to escape the stigma that was developing on the Lebensborn children. And then she became Swedish, in fact. But your parents didn't stay in Sweden, and they actually continued traveling onwards.
Yeah, they worked for a few months in England before my father landed this job with the Norwegian subsidiary of ITT in Oslo. That, of course, also marked my life because when he was working there in the early 70s, he was planning the entire telecommunications network in Norway today. So he still, I mean, he passed away last year, but as long as he kept his memory, he could still identify a phone number because he had placed all the phone centrals. But ITT was an international company. It's now Alcatel. And they were doing a lot of collaboration with the Spanish branch of ITT. So from I was about 3 years onwards, we always had Spanish friends in the house. And that's basically why I speak Spanish. I didn't learn Spanish then, but I had these contacts with Spain from that early age on. And so when I came in for a shift in my career, because I started doing Norwegian history, then I went on to do Spanish history, and now more Norwegian history again. As an early modernist, sources are scarce and rare. And the Norwegian sources are often very terse, very short. And I thought, okay, I want to study this subject, which was witchcraft trials, in a country where you have more written documentation. So what other languages do I know? I know French, but not good enough to do this. I know English, but then there's going to be 1,000 Americans for every witch. And I know Spanish. Okay. So it became Spanish. So that's how I started working on the Inquisition.
But if you speak about your interest in history, when did you first mark it? Do you remember? When was the moment that you thought to yourself, well, history, fascinating?
I can't remember, honestly. There's no exact moment that I can put this on. I never knew what I wanted to be. I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up. It's I think it's more casual than anything else. What I really like to do is to find patterns. I like to see things that are complete chaos and try to find meaningful order in it. So I could equally have been an engineer as a historian. The one thing that I would not do is something like a very theory-heavy social sciences. No, I want the messy stuff and make order of it. And I want to accept that things are not uniform. They are multivariate, and they are going to be breaking with whatever patterns you find. That's really what I enjoy. I also would not do contemporary history, which I think is a waste of time, because if you're really that interested in what's going around you and you really penetrate why things are exactly the way they are, then you should be a politician. I could not study our problems today without wanting to fix them. So contemporary history for me is meaningless. It's not uninteresting, but as an academic discipline, not relevant. I would never do that. So that was a very conscious choice on my part.
And when did you actually make the choice to become a historian? Was it already at school or later?
Later. I think I decided it when I was in the army. And I decided, okay, I'm going to study humanities. And then there was no program for history. So you were accepted to the Faculty of Humanities, and then you had 3 one-year courses and then 1 half-year course. And I chose folklore, folkloristics, history of ideas, and history. And it wasn't obvious to me that it was going to be history in the end, but that's what it became. But I mean, both of those two influenced me greatly, at least, or especially folkloristic has really informed a lot of my thinking about popular culture and cultural traditions and how things change and are being transmitted. So continuity and change in oral culture is really something that I learned a lot about from my background in folkloristics before I went on to do history.
Then you went to university, then you did studies, and when did the shift to history occur and why? If you have an idea,
Yeah,
because maybe it's interesting to reflect why history after all.
I cannot tell you because I don't really know. I worked a year as an intern in a satellite communications company before I spent 1 year in the army. And then when I came out of the army, I decided I'll do humanities, and I cannot remember why. I think, I mean, if I'm going to go back, I think it's probably because I went to terrible schools. They were really, really bad. I and one other kid, we were doing really, really good in maths, and the teachers kept us back because we were too far ahead of the others, and that really just killed it for me. If they hadn't done that, I would probably not have been a historian.
So we have to thank your teachers.
Or curse them.
Well, it depends at which side of your life you look. If it's the financial, then maybe curse. If it's in research, then maybe
Financially,
bless.
it's definitely a curse. So, but I mean, I always had that doubt where I was going to go, right? But I worked in a school where, sorry, I went to a school where if you were a bit smart, things were so easy that you never had to work for it. And it became so hard to have self-discipline. I mean, for example, I stopped doing homework in the 7th grade. It was in the 9th grade that
I
they discovered
recognize
that I
that.
had stopped. Yeah, 9th grade, they discovered I hadn't done anything. I mean, once you're in that, you do the minimum to get whatever you need to do, whatever you think you would do. And then you find something that you have an aptitude for that can hold your attention, that you actually have the self-discipline to do. Which may not be what you want to do, but it's what you can do, and you can do it well. And then you work on that, and then you succeed.
So once you finished your bachelor studies, was it evident to you that you also want to continue doing your studies further? Did you consider master already while doing bachelor, or it was something that came to you afterwards?
No, I decided on that that I wanted to do it, and especially because I noticed how much I enjoy putting chaos into order, and how much I enjoy trying to put complicated things into easy words, trying to explain complex things and situations in ways that are easy to understand. It was something that I felt really happy doing, and I thought I want to continue doing this. So my question was, what am I going to do?
Where?
No, where was clear. I wanted to continue in Oslo. And I had a list of 10 different subjects that I wanted to possibly explore. I don't remember all of them, but they span from antiquity to 1950s, because things are interesting to me. But I decided I'm not going to do contemporary history, because I think it's meaningless as an academic discipline in itself. If I do that, then I want to try to influence events. It would be just so frustrating to sit there with knowledge and not try to do anything with it. And so I ended up with what was probably at the top of my list, which was to work on witchcraft trials, where I picked up from my previous study in folkloristics the belief in witchcraft. And that was my main interest in approaching the witchcraft trials from the aspect of popular beliefs. And I noticed that the only really substantial work on this in Norway had been written with a complete lack of interest in beliefs. So I saw it as a wide open field. And I did that, and it did reasonably well, and not quite as well as it should have done in terms of grades. And it's one of my very few regrets in life that I did not complain about the grade that I had, that I received at the end. So I always tell my students that if you feel you have been treated unjustly, you should complain. And I will say I was treated unfairly. And the professor who did this was later fired. But the university did not consider me or any of the other people who crossed his way as in any way people who should have been taken care of. But I'm a person who never gives up. And so when I decided to do a doctorate, also on witchcraft trials, my road to getting that fellowship was much longer than other people's. I mean, I see people now getting it on the first attempt. I got it on the ninth because I never give up. I never give up. You cannot get rid of me.
That's a very good quality, I think, in history and in academia in general, because, well, the internet is full of people who could not persist long enough to stay.
But I have to say also, some people get there too easily.
That's also
and then and then you see people who never finish, for example, or never accomplish anything. So it goes both ways. But that was a long, hard slog. I worked as a research assistant and teaching assistant in those years, which taught me a lot about different aspects of history that I would otherwise not have learned. So some of the dark sides of the university, I have to say. But I mean, I never give up, so I persevered, and I got my PhD fellowship. Then, of course, I don't give up, so I finished on time.
I recognize that I also finished on time. Exactly.
And you know, I was so determined after this resistance and this experience of being treated so unfairly that I was going to show them I was going to do this, and I was going to do it on time. In the end, I was able to hand it in on time, but somehow they decided that they wanted to fund me for some extra months, so I didn't even apply for it, as far as I can remember, because I didn't need it, but they gave it to me anyway, so I did it. That did quite well. Then it was hard after that, but I'm trying to remember the exact dates here. I think I was unemployed for a bit after that, and then I don't quite remember if I then got the teaching position, the temporary teaching position, or the postdoc. I don't quite remember which came first of those two. Yeah, probably the postdoc on a further project. And that was a fantastic opportunity for me. But I was then the only and first historian on a personal postdoc at the University of Oslo. So my department didn't know what to do with me because they had a couple of other postdocs, but they came in on projects. So they had mentors and supervisors and things, and I was all alone because my supervisor had retired. But that worked out very well. And then I spent, for my PhD, I spent 1 year in Madrid, a bit more than a year in Madrid. Now I spent a bit more than a year in Valencia. But this time I was in a department at the University of Valencia. The first year I was in the archive. And this, of course, improved my Spanish a lot, gave me a much wider net of contacts in Spain. And then I had a 2-year teaching position at the University of Oslo, temporary position. Then I was unemployed again, and then I got a temporary position at Telemark University College. And then I got a permanent position there. Sorry?
Where is that college located?
In Telemark. It's now part of what is called the University of Southern Norway. And then I worked there for 3.5 years before I got my permanent position at the University of Bergen. So I worked for 3 different Norwegian institutions.
And do you think that the current position is the current university? Is it any different from Oslo or from Telemark as an institution?
Oh, it's very different from I mean, Telemark was then not a university. It is now it's been fusioned with other university colleges to become a university. So for instance, we didn't have a master's program, and of course no doctor's program. I taught in teacher training.
Just like many universities or well, those technical universities in Norway that focus a lot on teachers training.
Yeah, and those students are not any worse academically than the students that I taught at University of Oslo, University of Bergen. It's a bit hard for me to compare Oslo and Bergen because things have changed so much. The whole Bologna process has transformed our universities. More or less as I switched between them. And of course, the University of Oslo has changed beyond recognition since I left.
There's no longer a department for early modern history in
Well, there never was. There was a department for history that became a department for archaeology, history, conservation, I think. And Bergen is also archaeology, history, cultural, not history, but I don't quite recall what they call it, and the history of religion. So we have this massive conglomerate departments. I was in Oslo working there when they were joined, so I was part of that or lived through that process. But I mean, the big change in Oslo since then has been a complete change in their hiring process, which means that they have hired so many Germans now.
also in Bergen.
No, much more in Oslo. Much more in Oslo. And they have hired so many foreigners that they have problems teaching Norwegian history. So in my eyes, they have made a strategic mistake. And you know, it's not really diversity if you hire so many people from the same foreign country. If you have somebody from Belgium, somebody from France, somebody from Spain, somebody from Portugal, somebody from Italy, somebody from Kenya, then yeah. But if you have 5 or 6 Germans, no, that's not diversity at all.
Well, maybe they're from different Bundesländer.
Yeah, no, I heard one of my, I'm not going to complain about an institution that I don't work at, but I heard a colleague at the university also complain that he came to his research group for a meeting. They were speaking in German because they were all Germans. And I think then at the university, you are in trouble. And I'll just add, the professor who told me that was also not Norwegian.
But I think that at the same time, it's if some of them teach Norwegian history, it could be an interesting perspective.
Of
Because
course, but they don't.
I'm doing, among others, research in Dutch history, and I think that my perspective on Dutch history is different than that of a regular Dutch person who is interested in his own history, because a look from outside can always bring something new. But of course, if there are a lot of them,
Absolutely.
other things, then
Absolutely.
it's a different story.
Absolutely. And my good friend and mentor, Jean-Pierre Didier, was always saying this. It's a great advantage to study a different country than the one you are from. But that's not what we're talking about here. It's people who are working on their own home country, but in Norway. But I mean, of course, I see Spanish history in ways that Spanish people don't. But having worked on Spanish history for 20 years, when I started working on Norwegian history again, I have a completely different vision of it than my Norwegian colleagues who never worked on anything else. I mean, I see things that they don't see. And I think this is really fruitful for me to go back on working on Norwegian history now, because that is a completely different experience than it was 30 years ago.
I want to ask you about the shift from Telemark to Bergen, because I think that a lot of people nowadays struggle with getting jobs and go on many interviews and or don't, because a lot of people don't even get invited. So what do you think that did it for you? To be actually invited for that interview and to eventually also get that position?
Uh, well, frankly, because my competence is unique, and that I do Norwegian history and Spanish history. And of course, I've also written about the Portuguese in India using Portuguese sources. Uh, Nobody else had that when everybody else was working either on only Norway or only some other foreign country. And nobody else had that. And that when you come to a research university as a historian, you are no longer just teaching at an undergraduate level. You also have to supervise master students and PhDs. And then it's really important to be able to deal with students at that university with their levels of competence, their interest, and their linguistic skills. And that means that even though I, at that time, was mostly researching Spanish history, most of the students that I was supervising were working on Norwegian history. And because I had done that myself, and I had known the archives, I knew the language, I knew the literature, then I could be an effective supervisor for them, even though I wasn't actively researching that myself at that time. And that made me a very attractive hire, because then obviously I can teach European history as well as Norwegian history, but anybody can do that with a little bit of preparation. But I could also supervise on various countries, but especially, of course, Spain and Norway. And nobody else who applied for that position had that competence. So that was the one thing that sort of ensured that I would get it. The other thing was simply that I had published more. I would like to say better, but I can definitely say more.
Well, I think that being unique is important, and it's something that a lot of people forget about. And there are trends in research, and a lot of people follow in those trends. But I think that nowadays you're engaged with something that we could say is very trendy. And I would say it's the trendy thing that is there, because you're dealing with artificial intelligence, and you have just published artificial intelligence model that can be used for, well, very useful for historians. Maybe you could tell a little bit about that.
Yeah, so this is tied very much to database use. And I think, well, thank you for your kind words. I don't think that these models are going to be very popular because they're very specific. But the thing is, you can train or fine-tune these large language models to do specific tasks. And they are incredibly useful for us because what they excel at is working with language. And what we do as historians is working with language. And I started doing this a bit over a year ago, so quite early, because I saw when ChatGPT was published that it could solve a problem for me, which was that I had access to lots of documents in the form of biographies that contained information about historical figures that I wanted in a database. When they were born, where they went to university, what positions they had, who they married, and so on. Because this is a bit difficult to explain without showing it. But I was embarking on a project with Louise Kallestrup from the University of Southern Denmark on how the royal will, as expressed in the witchcraft statute of 1617, was transformed into concrete criminal trials. It was a statute that was directed directly at royal officials, and they were listed by their officers. And we knew that it resulted in an increase of trials. I was one of those who had studied this, but we did not understand, or nobody had tried to see, how exactly did the royal officials do this? And one thing is that the king says this should be done, and another thing is it actually happens. Okay, who does it? And who doesn't? And why? And what do they have in common? And once you get into that, then suddenly a database about information or with information about these figures is very interesting. And I had worked on a historical database of Spanish royal officials that had a lot of interest, but it was made over a period of 23 years. And I knew that I don't have 23 years because I'll be retired by then. And we have a 4-year-old project, a 4-year project. But I have these written biographies in biographical encyclopedias. And so what my French, Chilean, and Spanish colleagues have done was they had taken these published biographies of these Spanish royal officials and then copied and pasted, retyped, and sort of transformed the text from the published biographies into database entries. And when ChatGPT was launched, I thought, this could probably do that because it's really good at transforming text. I mean, people are using it like Wikipedia, which is stupid. They're asking it to write the text for them, which is less stupid, but not always fruitful. But what it really excels at is transforming text. I mean, if you can use it, for example, as an academic editor, you can give it your manuscript and say, please make this more formal, or remove all grammatical errors, or make this conform to the convention of this journal. And it does that for you, just like a good secretary would. And that is a very productive use of it, instead of saying, write me an article that says so and so. But you can make it transform your text. It's the same. You can give it a short biography and then tell it to give me as a CSV file, comma-separated values that you can import into a database or Excel or whatever. All the life events mentioned in this that have a specific year attached to them. Omit everything that doesn't have a year and write it in this format: name, event, place, date. And it can do that. And I can see that immediately. This was in January last year. No, sorry, that was December last year. And then in January, I discovered that, hey, it has an API, an application programming interface. So I can write a little program on my computer that sends it text files, and they come back formatted in this way that I want. And so I did a little programming, and then I sort of, okay, I can do a 19-volume encyclopedia in a weekend.
Wow.
Which is quite a bit better than 23 years. It wasn't faultless. It had errors. It needed formatting. It needed work. But of course, this was the beginning. So this is the future. And so I've been working ever since then in refining my methods, ever better models, ever bigger context windows. And the context window is basically the limitation of how much text you can send and receive at once. The models that I have fine-tuned and published now do this for a specific database of Danish and Norwegian historical figures. And the reason I publish it is both to document how you can do it, document my own knowledge in doing it, but also because it is useful and it's going to be available and useful in the future. So anybody can use it if they need to build a database in this format. So there's no reason for me to keep it secret to myself. I've also been using it to clean up and reformat data that I have in existing databases. We have, for example, a database of Inquisition trials in Portugal and Spain. And it has about 100,000 unique trials, plus 10,000 duplicates. And there are errors in there. And there are things that we want to have written in the same consistent way. The we need some help in finding more duplicates than the 10,000 we have found. Sometimes we have data from one field that should be in a different field, and been using AI for all that. And it's getting easier and easier to do so, in part because the context windows are getting bigger and the models are becoming smarter. So the more I work on it, the more I can do, and the more possibilities I see. And I think and then I made an agreement with Norwegian AI Research Center in Trondheim that they're going to train some new models on modern Norwegian, and then I will train them on early modern Danish, and we'll see what we can use those for. So that's part of what I'm going to do this year.
That sounds really fascinating and I think very useful. And I only hope that other institutions and scholars will take example and implement it also on other languages, because that would be extremely helpful. So I would like to thank you for our conversation. I think it was very interesting. And I also thank you for your passion for history, because I think it was very clear throughout our talk that you're passionate about what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you.